the idea of a remake, it would be Atlantis. Although I don't know, that budget would be north of 200 million, pal. There was so much stuff that went on in that movie.
But it'd be
That
worth
would be
every
one.
single penny. Every
Yeah,
single
yeah,
penny.
that,
I don't
yeah,
care if it's
that,
three
that would
hours
be.
long. Get it made. Hi guys, welcome to the penultimate episode of Interval Conversations. I'm so happy to be joined today by an incredible screenwriter, Mr. Tab Murphy. Tab, how are you doing?
Nathan, I'm doing well. I'm over here, 8 hours away, removed from you. I
Yeah,
think eight, maybe 11, maybe I
yeah,
think it's eight.
yeah.
And it's Thursday afternoon in Los Angeles. The sun is shining. I'm breathing. I consider that a win.
Oh,
So it's a good day.
yes. So, for the people who might not know you, you are a screenwriter and you've done so many TV shows as well. You were responsible for Hunchback of Notre Dame, Tarzan, Atlantis, perfect film. But what I want to know first is how did you first get into this industry? Where did it all begin?
Well, that's an interesting and somewhat complicated question to answer, because the truth of the matter is, if I really think about where it probably began when I was 5 or 6 years old, watching my version of Atlantis: The Lost Empire as a kid. You know, it probably began, back in those days when I was raised in the 60s, the mid to late 60s into the 70s. Going to the movies was such a huge part of my childhood. My parents took us to movies, my brothers and sisters, movies. A triple feature on Saturday afternoon at the movie theater was like our babysitter. And I don't want to say that my mom was a bad parent, but there was a drop off. Here's money for your brothers and sisters. Go in. I'll pick you up at 5. See ya. Boom. And we would go into these theaters and watch three movies back to back to back, and we wouldn't even think about it. We just, we had money for popcorn, and the movies were, I mean, they could be Godzilla movies, they could be, they could be Disney movies, they could be. It was just, so it was a world of magic that I felt introduced to at a very early age, and that experience of when the lights go down in the theater, right? It just, this sort of like catharsis occurs even as a kid, where you trust and you give yourself over to whatever is going to be showing, whether it's a comedy or a monster movie or this or that. And it was just such an amazing place, and a not to steal from Hunchback, but a sanctuary in many ways, as for me, as I continue to go to movies through my teen years. And I just was enraptured, and I would even go alone if a movie was playing. I didn't. A lot of people won't go to a movie alone when they're a teenager, but I did, because I just could not get enough. I could not get enough. So I think that's really where it began. But I will say that by the time I graduated high school and thought about college, I I believed at that time that I wanted to be a forest ranger, that I wanted to, you know, I had this affinity for nature and grew up backpacking and camping. So I thought, yeah, forest ranger, that sounds like a good job. So I went away to school to do that. And I just ran into this brick wall of classes like chemistry and biology and biological science. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I mean, like, because this is all math, and this is not horseback riding 101, or how to build a fire, or how to save campers, being attacked by a bear. This was all stuff that I like, wait a minute. So there was a disconnect for me. And that was, I think, in my first year of college, there came an epiphany where I realized that this wasn't, as much as I love the outdoors and the idea of the romanticized idea of being a forest ranger, this was not my path. This was just not my path. So I looked in the mirror and I asked myself, I remember distinctly, you know, asking myself, what do you really want to do, Tab? What do you really want to do? And just going with the first answer that blurted out of my mouth. And it was, I want to go to Hollywood and I want to get into movie making. I want to be, I want to tell stories through film. So I was a little shocked about the answer, but now as I look back and reflect on it, it makes perfect sense. Because not only did I love movies growing up, but I also loved writing. And I had an affinity for it throughout middle school and high school, and an affinity that I rather ignored, to be honest. Even though I had teachers saying, "Boy, and I was forced to take my stories into other classrooms and read them, and I was an introvert and shy, and that was terrifying. So there was a part of me is like, no, I don't want to do that anymore. But so I in my first year of college, I transferred. I applied and transferred to USC Film School, and I often say this, and I still believe it's true, that I owe a lot to my parents, because I think there's a there can be a moment in any young person's life where they think about an idea, they think about a passion they want to follow, and it may even sound off the rails. It may even sound weird and out there. Uh, and I think a lot of well-meaning parents sometimes put the kibosh on dreams by just being overly protective of their kids, and they don't mean it. They don't mean to be dream crushers. That's not their job. But I think they, step in and start saying, well, how do you think you can do that? Yeah, I don't think you can do that. It's dangerous. Or you can't do that. We got to, that kind of thing. So I really think my parents, I really thank them, because when I called them that day after deciding that's what I wanted to do, I mean, at first I was met with stony silence, which is natural. Like they knew nothing about anything about the movie business. I could have said, I want to go to Mars and I want to live up there with aliens, and they would have still had the same reaction. But you know my parents were cool, because after a brief pause they said, well, we don't know anything about that, but we'll support whatever you want to chase, whatever dream you want to chase. So I really that was a moment, that I got some validation, even for a harebrained brain scheme of going to Hollywood and trying to get into the movie business. So I thank my parents a lot, because if they would have said in that moment, honestly, Nathan, if they would have said, yeah, we're not sure about that. That sounds too different, too scary. You don't know anybody in Los Angeles. That's not a good idea. Why don't you think about community college? If you're not happy, fine. And a lot of, I mean, some kids, would listen to that, and they would say, "Oh yeah, maybe they're right, and maybe I shouldn't." And so I'm very grateful to my folks for giving me the room to explore, and being supportive, even when they didn't know anything about it, and frankly, were probably terrified at the idea of me going to LA in those days. So that's really where it began. That's really where it's began.
Yeah, 'cause who would you class as your writing influences from over the years for when you're creating a story?
Uh, Well, most of my writing influences, I mean, my first year at film school, I took a screenwriting class, because I mean, I knew movies were written, but I really didn't know that there was a craft involved, and that there was, that screenwriting was really a perfect synergy of craft and storytelling, inspiration, sort of, combined. I'd always enjoyed telling stories. So it was really a part of, and I read voraciously as a kid, and a lot of it was, the usual fantasy, sci-fi, stuff that just, but, again, I mean, you're talking about the late 60s, early 70s. So, quite a bit less was available, but I still, got off on authors like Arthur C. Clarke, and so I remember one summer just reading all of the James Bond books, all of Ian Fleming's James Bond books from this cover. I just, I would just devour stuff. So I read a lot, but mainly I think it was the combination of reading, but it was also the combination of watching a lot of movies, and adjusting a storytelling, my storytelling to that medium. And especially when I took that screenwriting class that first year at USC, everything just sort of dovetailed into a moment of, wow, okay, here we go. This is how I feel like I could break into the movie business, by writing good scripts. And so that's really what set me on my path as a writer.
Yeah. Because you did eventually break into the film industry. Could you tell us about some of the films you've been involved with over the years?
Well, sure, sure. I mean, like I say my first big break, but it's really, I call it now my first big year, because in 1988, I had, and I got my first job in like 1983, so it took about 5 years. And it's like the movie business is not one of those businesses, and certainly screenwriting is not one of those businesses where once you sort of get a job, you're guaranteed a job forever. You're like, oh, I broke in and now it's just an ascending. No, no, man. I got a job, and I did a pretty okay job, and then I got another job, and then I went on unemployment for a year, and so it's that sort of roller coaster. That first 5 years was all about meetings and trying to stay afloat, and get my name out there and write scripts and things. But the real sort of, I always look at a 1986, 87 is 87 mainly as the year that I broke through, and I wrote a movie called Gorillas in the Mist. And at the same time, I wrote a movie and sold it called My Best Friend is a Vampire. So this is the weirdest thing, because in 1988, both of those movies came out within 4 months of each other. So the first movie that came out was My Best Friend is a Vampire, which is a teen comedy, right? Which was a teen comedy. Now, that, without going into a lot of details, I kind of sold that idea. I wrote the script. The director came in, he rewrote a lot of my jokes. And anyway, it doesn't matter. What matters is it came out, and I remember going, I got to go to a theater and see my movie. This is going to be like, this is what I dreamed of. This is my moment to actually sit in a theater and see something I wrote on the screen. So I go, I get in line, and I'm literally in line, and I had bought my ticket. I hand it to the ticket guy, who's, I think, mentoring a rookie on the job, talking to him, and he says, and yeah, this other movie playing My Best Friend of the Vampire. It sucks, man. Just as I'm handing him my ticket, and I'm like, oh my God, talk about a knife in the heart. I go into that movie. I am in the theater with two other people, a dad and his daughter, and that's it. And this is like prime time, showtime, right? And 20 minutes into the movie, they get up and leave. So that was my first experience of seeing one of my films on the screen. It was so depressing.
Oh,
So now, check this out. Now you jump 4 months ahead, Gorillas in the Mist comes out, and it's just the entirely opposite experience, right? It's just the entirely opposite experience. It's it gets great reviews. Uh, it uh, it just was such a, and I ended up getting nominated for an Oscar for screenwriting on that movie, right? So I'm really thankful for that year, because it showed me the best of times and it showed me the worst of times you could have as a screenwriter, all within a few months of each other, man. So it was a really kind of cool lesson, and it's one that I always kind of took forward with me in my career, which is that you never get too high for the highs and you never get too low for the lows. That you just find a middle ground and you stay calm and you just weather any storm. And and that's kind of how I've managed to survive in a career where there's not a lot of longevity for screenwriters these days, in Hollywood. I mean, so anyway, lesson learned early that I was thankful for, as my point, I guess.
yeah. What is your creative process when you're writing these films? Like, how Do you sit down for quite a while? Do you lock yourself in a room? What's your process for writing these?
Um, well, of course, a lot of it depends on what kind of movie I'm writing. There's quite a bit of a difference between writing a live action movie like Gorillas in the Mist, and say writing on the Disney movies that I worked on. The Disney, it's so interesting because the Disney films, I began Hunchback, I want to say, and probably writing on it in 94, maybe 94, 93, late 93. So I was just a few years removed from Gorillas in the Mist and, trying to get other projects. I was trying to get a movie made. I wanted to direct a movie that I wrote that eventually got made. So when I went into work, when I finally, like Disney had been, without going into details, Disney uh, had approached me several times to come in and see if there was anything that that might light my fire, that I could potentially work on with them. And at that time, honestly, Nathan, I was not only focused on getting a movie made, a live action movie I wanted to direct, but I had this perception that Disney movies were just cartoons for kids. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I didn't want to do that. I fancied myself a rather serious writer, you see, and I wanted to write, adult dramas and adventures and things, and I wanted to stay in the live action kind of, side of things. So I resisted for a while, and then a series of events occurred, and I had some time, and I needed to pay my bills, which, believe it or not, I mean, we all have to do that, even screenwriters in Hollywood. So I always get a kick out of people that say, "Why did like, my favorite actor? Why did he make that piece of crap movie?" Well, he probably had to pay his mortgage, man. That screenwriter wrote that terrible movie. Why'd he do that? Well, he probably had, 6 kids he had to feed, So it's like sometimes our choices are limited because we have to go with what's available because we do have bills to pay, man. We got a life to lead. Cha-cha is that from whatever movie that's from. And, so, but in this case, I had, I got the movie I wanted to direct got financed. We had a star, but he had 2 other movies to make before he could make mine. So I had this window of like 5 months that had to like find work. And Disney came calling at that time. And so I finally agreed to go in and sit down and, just talk to them, just, sit with the guys and see what they had. And in that meeting is when they, toward the end of it, they said, yeah, and one of the other projects we're trying to do is we're trying to find out if there's a Disney animated movie in this book called Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo, right? So now what they didn't know, but everybody that knew me intimately knew, that I was a monster freak growing up. I was a monster kid of the 60s. I loved all the Universal monsters like Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, all of those, Mummy. And in those days, the Hunchback, even though he wasn't a monster per se, he was human, he was lumped in with all that cast of Universal monster characters, right? So I, as a kid, grew up collecting monster magazines. I was aware of that story. I knew that story of the Hunchback. And when they put that on the table, it was like, bam, this is exactly why I'm here. This is the moment I'm supposed to be here, and this is the project I'm supposed to do. And that's how it happened. So the process of working for Disney, though, was very different than working on my own. Like in live action, you get an assignment. You talk it over with the producer or the studio, the executives. You all agree on what they call a take, and then you're expected to go away for 4 to 6 to 8 weeks and write a first draft. Well, in animation, it's completely the opposite. I mean, you don't even write the script until well deep into the process of figuring out story and characters. And what they do is they write an outline that becomes another outline that becomes an expanded outline that then becomes a treatment that becomes an expanded treatment. Dude, I have never worked so hard in my fucking life in that when since when I worked for Disney. I mean, I thought I knew what writing was. Holy, I mean, I was writing my ass off. But and I always look at those 10 years of working for Disney and those four movies, Hunchback, Tarzan, Atlantis, and Brother Bear, as the best writing school I could have ever gone to, because they were it. I joke around sometimes and I say, you know what? When I'm happy with a script and I think, oh, this is good, this is badass, right? And I turn it in, I go, they're gonna like this, and like in the live action world, producers do, oh, this is great, this is great. Disney's reaction is always, well, it's a good start. So, and what they mean by that is they just, I mean, like you think of an onion, right? And how many layers you can peel off of an onion. And as a writer, I'd been peeling off one or two or three. At Disney over that 10 years, I learned how to peel that thing right down to the core, man, because they dig deep on every aspect of story. They dig deep on character, they dig deep on setting, they dig deep on conflict, on emotion, on everything. It just taught me to be such a better writer working in that system. It was awesome, and to this day, it just is a highlight of my career. Those years spent working on those movies.
It's like with Hunchback as well. Disney, I think up to then, had only done like minor dark themes. Then obviously Hunchback comes along. What was that process like?
Yeah,
Because obviously,
well, it's funny you say that. It's funny you asked that because I was I was really concerned early on. I mean, I love the story of the Hunchback, but I knew, I mean, this is a story that essentially is a tragedy. It's also a story that has a lot of adult themes in it. And I was like really concerned because I didn't know the process at Disney. And I just thought, wow, I initially said yes. And then I like took a step back and I wanted to know, what does that mean though? What is your vision of this movie? Because if it really is about turning this amazing piece of literature into singing and dancing, cuddly and just totally whitewashing all of the thematics of it, I'm not interested in telling that story. I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that. But to Disney's credit, they were really, they were coming off a string of musicals. Even though Hunchback was a musical, all of the stuff before that had been really sort of like uplifting and happy and joyful and this and that. And there was a desire in Disney within the ranks to sort of stretch their wings a little bit and do something different. And this is what I mean about when that book landed on the table. I didn't realize at the time, but that was the first domino of an entire train of dominoes that would lead me into working on that movie, but not only working on it, but being allowed to explore some of the darker aspects of the thematics of that book and being told, don't worry, you write what you want, write it the way you see it, you let us worry about our brand. We'll obviously, I mean, if you write a scene that's like so over the like so off brand for us, we'll pull it back and we'll give you notes, but we don't want to censor you going into this. We know about the adult themes in this material and we want you to explore them. Now, obviously, we're going to have to explore them in a way that is a lot, that will still be, under the Disney banner. But so I was really encouraged very early on in that process that we could do something different, unique, that hadn't been done at Disney before. And when I think about that movie in particular, and then Atlantis, the follow-up to it, I came to Disney at a time for me that was very lucky as a writer because they were exploring more than just doing sort of cookie cutter model of the next Disney animated, you know, film. They wanted to stretch out, and so I feel very fortunate, especially for those two movies, that I got to work on those.
'Cause, I've just got to a couple of fan questions, because obviously you worked on Atlantis as well. My friend
Yes.
Frank has sent in a couple of questions about Atlantis and about Disney
Oh,
as well.
Frank.
Yes, Frank Bucklin. Um, so why did they choose a linguist as the main character in Milo? What were the thoughts behind that?
Well, I mean, Milo was a character that we felt needed to be a bit of a MacGuffin for the team of explorers.
Yeah.
So we needed him to have a reason to be there. We needed him to have a reason to exist in this movie. We knew all the cool things we wanted him to do, but a very up front, we needed him to be, somebody that would be perceived as an integral part of the team, even though, most of the other team members looked at him as an outsider to begin with. So I think that the inspiration for Milo being a linguist, uh, and being on the trail of Atlantis, even before the movie starts, was something we thought, would help us get into the story a lot quicker, a lot sooner, and give him the ability not only to help them get to Atlantis, but then to communicate and to begin to empathize with the plight of the Atlanteans. So that I mean, so it was more a function of storytelling than it was that I had this brilliant lightning bolt of inspiration. Let's make him a linguist. I mean, it was really more of the idea that like that scene where he's in the basement of the Natural History Museum. It's we wanted him to be someone who was smart, dedicated, passionate, have a dream, but was being held back by bureaucracy. You know what I mean? Was just being held back by, and so that sort of, we wanted that passion to come out, and so it just so that's why he's a linguist. It's just, in talking about his character and as the story evolved, it just made sense. I mean, early on, there was iterations of Milo where he was a descendant of Blackbeard the pirate in one iteration, so that his desire to go on an adventure, his desire, and that Blackbeard somehow his mythology was tied to Atlantis. So his desire to go on this adventure was all about clearing his family name. You know what I'm saying? So that was for a while, that was kind of where we thought. And this just goes to show that, these stories evolve, and they evolve at Disney like no other place I've ever worked, because they just think of it, every scenario inside and out, and finally, you just have this melange of just ideas, and it's just like it's churning and it's churning, and then finally, like cream, the best ideas rise to the top. You know what I mean? But they churn for a long fucking time, dude. And so what that means is that I'm writing outline after outline after outline of possibilities of who Milo could be, what could be his big want, because that's a big Disney checkbox. Every hero of theirs has to have a want. What do they want out of life? So, linguistics was not the first choice, but ultimately the best choice for the story that we were concocting that came after it.
You mentioned Disney evolving as well, and this question ties in with that as well. Were there any major differences from the start of the film to what went out? So, like the design of Atlantis, how they got there, that sort of thing.
Well, I can speak to differences in the story
Mm.
more so than, uh, you know, there the story evolved on a trajectory that that you can trace all the way back to a lunch that I had with Don Hahn, the producer, and Kirk and Gary, the directors. That is really where the DNA of Atlantis began, because we had come off of Hunchback and I was finishing up on Tarzan. And those guys had such a great experience on Hunchback. They were really of a mind to keep the team together. And thankfully, they considered me part of that team. So we all got together, the four of us, and they had, because of Beauty and the Beast and because now of Hunchback, two classy productions, right? I mean, and Beauty and the Beast was nominated for Best Picture, let's not forget. So those guys, in particular, had quite a bit of cachet at the studio at that moment in time. And so when we went out to have lunch and talk about what do we want to do next as a collaborative team, uh, it was very clear early on that Kirk and Gary and Don did not want to do another musical.
Mm.
And as Kirk always sort of characterized it, he said, for the last couple of movies, when you enter Disneyland, you take a right turn into Fantasyland. And he said, that's where we've been for the last few movies. He said, I want to walk into Disneyland and make a left turn into Adventureland. That's where I want to go. Let's make an adventure, kind of a boy's own like adventure. And then we started talking about a lot of the movies we loved growing up as kids, the movies that sort of inspired us. Some of them were Disney movies, some of them weren't. Journey to the Center of the Earth comes to mind. And we talked a lot about the kinds of movies we loved. And then that talk, after several margaritas, I might add, evolved into talking about, okay, well, what do we want to do? And I think by the end of that lunch, we were all like convinced that we wanted to do a story about explorers going into the earth. We wanted to do a story about a young man who suddenly is thrust into a situation with a team of adventurers going into the earth after something. We didn't know. We didn't even know. I mean, Atlantis was one of a list of like 20 things that we listed they could have found under the earth, right? Uh, so that was really the idea, and that this journey into the earth was going to be a journey of this meek and mild kind of kid growing into a man. And we knew that. I mean, because that's a template for a lot of these adventure stories anyway, going back. So so just as much as Kirk and Gary and Don you know had cachet at the studio, I had a lot of cachet with the three of them because they trusted me based on our working relationship on Hunchback. So they entrusted me with the idea of bringing them back stuff that would then begin to percolate with them, that would then begin to fire their imagination, that would then begin to coalesce ultimately into a story. So that's what I did. I mean, so I had a lot of fun, and they gave me a lot of license, and the first treatment I handed those guys was a complete and total dud, was a total misfire, because I was like, I made the decision, okay, Atlantis, let's say they find Atlantis, let's go for it, So I wrote a treatment, the majority of which took place underwater, like I had scenes of Atlantis was under this dome under the sea, and that when they went outside the dome, they had all this special gear that they could breathe underwater, and they rode great white sharks and shit like that, and there were great battles and all this stuff. And the guys were like, the guys were like, Tab, it's kind of cool, but fuck, it's not like what we want. We want to explorers going into the earth. And I said, oh yeah, right, okay. So anyway, sometimes, and that's a process too. Sometimes, a writer has to clear out stuff in his own brain that might be in there, sort of influencing the process or whatever. So that was my clear out my brain attempt. And then I went away more determined than ever to crack the story because A, I knew we were onto something cool. B, I did not want to disappoint these guys, man. I liked them all. They were great. They were cool. And so I went away and I literally, I don't know sometimes how inspiration hits you or where ideas come from, but I just opened myself up and boom, all these ideas started to pop into my head and I used them all. And the linchpin for me was the Shepherd's Journal, like creating a mythology that existed prior to the movie, very much like Journey to the Center of the Earth, right? Arnie Saknussemm, and he left the marks on the walls for them to follow into the earth, right? So once I had the Shepherd's Journal, I had Milo. Once I kind of figured out the team, then I don't know, I sat down and I think I wrote like 5 pages, just five burst out of me. And I didn't even finish it. I just sent it to the guys. I said, what do you think about this? And then he came back and said, that's amazing. Keep going. So I knew we were onto, we kind of, broke ground as it were. And so that's how it started. And then it just continued to evolve from there. But my point is that the story itself, from the time I broke it with that, and then subsequent outlines, it got tighter and stronger, never really changed all that much. I mean, characters deepened and relationships deepened and conflicts were tightened, and characters became defined and things like that. But the overall spine of the story, what happened, what was going to happen, this big sequences, this, that, didn't really change much. So I was very proud of that. Uh, but again, it's one of the most collaborative mediums I've ever worked in. So you just when I was working on that movie in particular, I knew that, there were just 300 people behind me that were going to make me look like a freaking genius, dude. Because, I might have an idea, but they were going to animate it and storyboard it and bring it to life and color it. And it was just going to pop off the screen. And I just had so much faith and trust in that process by that time that I had a blast. I had a blast writing that. So.
Because how far along in the creative process were you involved with? Did it stop at a point, or did you carry on going, "Oh, I can help you with this new idea"? Like if the animators came to you and suggested
Oh
some.
yeah, no, listen, I was, Kirk and Gary and Don were very generous about about including me in meetings with artists, but they set a precedent in on Hunchback with that. So, so that was, but they also recognize that that's a vital part of the creative process of in terms of like creating a story, because they're brilliant storyboard artists and story artists who can just, you know, take a little idea and turn it into something amazing. So that they wanted me there to see that process, to see what they would come up with and integrate the things that they loved that were coming up into the script, and then vice versa. So it was a very symbiotic relationship. I'd write sequences, they would take those sequences, they would come up with a different idea or an idea that leapt off of my original idea and turn it into something greater. And so it was always this evolving collaborative process, writing and artists and images and character designs starting to really come into focus as I kept writing, and then you begin to write to the voices of what they've designed, and everything is just it's and that's 4 years it took to make that movie, dude. you know so I was on Atlantis probably almost 2 years, but I went off to do Brother Bear, and that's always kind of and that's also normal. That's like that you move on. And I always sort of and I've said this before, I sort of liken myself on these movies as a starting pitcher in a baseball game, you know, uh, and that my job was to get the team through the seventh inning with a lead, and then they would have their closers come in after me and do the sort of the 9 to 5 work of, you know, punching up scenes and jokes and dialogue and whatever other little shifts in the story that occurred. um, but that was, I always loved being in on the ground floor because that's where big ideas explode and happen, right? That affect the trajectory of the movie overall. And I love those moments where you're in a room and somebody has an idea or I have an idea or whatever, and everybody's just like, yes, you know. And you can see it already 4 years down the line. We know that's going to be in the movie. That's going to be a great sequence. The Leviathan, it's down there. It's this like lobster machine thing, and it's all these sunken ships from the different eras are down there in this graveyard. And I mean, we just, oh, we had so much fun, just riffing on stuff like that, man.
That used to terrify me as a kid, Leviathan. That used to terrify me
Well,
completely. Never mind the masks at the
I
end.
love that.
That's what scared me.
Yeah, no, yeah, no, and it's a machine with the eye. But I loved all that stuff, and that, that sort of the mystery of setting up the mystery and who built that and what are we going to find at the end of this journey. That's what we wanted. We wanted to, really create a sense of mystery and adventure, and then ultimately, it's funny because the journey itself. I mean, just to give you an idea how much leash I had on this movie. Generally, a animated screenplay comes in at about 85 or 90 pages. When I went off to script, finally, after all these treatments and all these ideas, and I had all this stuff I had to put into a screenplay, I said, so guys, I even knew. I mean, like, obviously there's too much stuff here. So what do you want me to cut out, or what do we want to let go of? And they were like, nothing, put it all in there. So my first draft, dude, was 142 pages long.
Oh,
Okay. Yeah, 142 pages long of just nothing. I mean, all sorts of everything, but there was lots of monsters, and the journey to Atlantis was just fraught with all these kind of adventures and monsters and this and that, to the point when they were developing it, I think it's Mike Mignola, right? He just called it. He designed. He was a designer, and he's a terrific, artist. He called it. He just stopped calling it Atlantis, and he said, "I'm just going to call it Monster Fest because that's what it feels like to me." So but that's, again, just that process of being allowed to, yeah, of course, the movie isn't going to be 2 hours and 25 minutes long. No way. But being able to write all that stuff in there, and then sort of with the directors and the producer and the story artists bringing it to life, and then going through and seeing ultimately what you have to lose and stuff at that time. It was a very, it just was liberating. I mean, it was, as a writer, to be able to just not have a lot of limitations in terms of not only length but my imagination, was just, that's why I say it's, like, it's the most fun I've had. I mean, as a writer, I mean, those 10 years, it really truly was.
are you going to be involved with Disney anymore? Because I know there's talks of a live action Hunchback coming out, supposedly.
Yeah. No, I'm not involved. That you have to understand, my era at Disney was the 90s. And so, and that's fine, but I no, I mean, I see that I'm listed as a creative consultant, but nobody's called me yet, but that's okay. I think that's just a nod to the team that made the movie that they're basing their live action movie on. I don't know about, listen, live action remakes in the Disney world have been a little underwhelming to me because, and I don't know, sometimes, look, I know there's a new generation of kids out there that could go see the sort of like photoreal version of Lion King and get just as much out of that as I got seeing it for the first time in '92. But frankly, me, in terms of where I am in my life and career, I'd like to hang on to the original
Yeah.
feeling uh, of seeing it the way I saw it, rather than seeing whatever different versions of it. So I mean, although I will say, and you mentioned the live action remake of Atlantis, if there's one movie, at least that I worked on, that would kill it as a live action remake, I think Atlantis would.
Oh yeah.
And I say that because it just, I'll tell you, the reason I believe that is because for the longest time, we all approached the movie as if it were a live action movie. They were, in fact, they were like, don't write it as an animated movie, Tab. Write it as a live action movie. Write this story as you would if you were writing it as a live action movie. They asked me to do that. So, and I did. And, so to me, if any of the four movies that I worked on that I would like to, what I would say, okay, I'd go with that. The idea of a remake, it would be Atlantis. Although I don't know, that budget would be north of 200 million, pal. There was so much stuff that went on in that movie.
But it'd be
That
worth
would be
every
one.
single penny. Every single
Yeah,
penny. I don't
yeah,
care if it's three
that would
hours long. Get it made.
I think it would just be, honestly, I think it would be cost prohibitive in this new era of, trying to be cost conscious and budget conscious. And I think Disney, they tried some of these big budget epic live action things that just tanked, and I think they're scared to even consider it. If Atlantis, upon initial release, had made $2 billion worldwide, they might consider it. But let's remember, Atlantis came out and was considered a disappointment at the studio. That's not normally a property a studio years later goes, oh yeah, let's remake that. Let's remake the movie that didn't make us any money. Yeah, not really gonna happen.
But I just have one last question for you, Tab.
Sure.
What advice do you have? Any advice for future writers or people wanting to get into this industry?
Well, yeah, that's another question I get asked a lot. I mean, advice. Uh, First of all, I would just say this, um, and it's a piece of advice that I learned the hard way because I almost didn't write those movies at Disney. I almost didn't do it because I had a perception about them, or I was focused on something else that I thought I wanted more. Uh, and I would just say this, inspiration or not even inspiration, opportunity sometimes doesn't smack you up the side of the head, right? Sometimes opportunity is like an annoying little gnat in your ear that you're trying to push away, right? So, and that's what Disney was for a good year before I finally said, okay, fine, let's just take that meeting, and then that gnat turned into a butterfly, beautiful, colorful butterfly, right? So that this is the thing I would say to anybody wanting to get in the movie business, especially as a writer, is just stay open. You have an idea possibly of what you want to do. I want to write a movie. I want to win an Oscar. Okay, that's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. Stay open, man, because here's the deal. These days, there's a lot of content providers out there, and that's animation, live action, and there's a blend these days. I mean, back when I worked at Disney, there was a clear demarcation between live action and animation. That line is blurred, man. That line is just blurred. It's gone. So I would just say stay open, and here's why. Because good storytelling, good writing is is good in any medium, right? It's good. I wrote a short not too long ago for puppets. Okay, that was a puppet short that was made by, and like 10 years ago I would like, are you out of your mind? I mean, like, I never would have done something like that, but it was one of the coolest things I've ever been involved in. So my advice is, look, you have to be good at your craft. You have to produce. So work on those things. But most important, don't get tunnel vision about what you think you want to do, because just stay open and just stay open and see where it leads you. Um, I think anybody with a tunnel vision idea of their career in the movie business these days is going to have a very short career. I've done more variety of writing over the last 10 years of my career than I have at any time in my career. Uh, and by the same token, I've had the most fun I've had too, in some ways, just doing different things, whether it's animation, whether it's a puppet film, whether it's live action, whether it's TV or cable miniseries. All these things uh, are just conduits to good storytelling, right? So be a good storyteller, and you'll find your way, man.
That has been some brilliant advice. Tab, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And
Oh, Nathan, I've had a ball. Listen, I appreciate you having me on, man. So it's been fun. Thank you.
thank you for joining, and thank you guys for tuning in to the penultimate episode of Interval Conversations.